Hi, I'm Amanda Marquez, and I'm in discussion AO4 in Ethnic Studies 1R. To get to know a little bit more about me, I'm a straight Mexican American female who comes from a working class family. I am currently 19 years old and a first generation college student at UC San Diego who's living on campus. Coming into this course, I came in with the knowledge of my race and even my own family being discriminated against and facing a long history of racialization. In week 7, we focused on labor and race-based nationalism. This included an insight from Dr. Sasaki and Professor Gauden on Asian immigration. Dr. Sasaki brings up the concept of racialization when Portuguese immigrants in Hawaii were identified as white, which also was discussed in Chapter 3 of Sasaki, How the Portuguese Became White. Racialization is a process in which groups of people are defined by their race and therefore social institutions are changed around their identity. The Portuguese felt the need to differentiate themselves from the Japanese because they were being pitted against each other in the plantations caused by the Big Five. These Big Five in the plantation economy were used as a social structure based on class and race in order to create cheap work that continued to dominate, which can easily be compared to slavery. The Portuguese started to obtain new characteristics of whiteness. They then were being racialized as Europeans, even though many of them stemmed from Africa, and were now being manipulated to be seen as white. This all relates to Professor Gauden's Friday lecture about how European immigrants were not wanted due to how expensive they were, and viewing Asians as an easy, cheap labor. It was easier to impose harsher conditions on Asian immigrants than it could on the Europeans, which Bonnichie states on page 161 of Asian Labor and the Development of California and Hawaii. In the quote introduced by Professor Gauden in lecture, Bonnichie continues to explain my next ideology of the trappings of imperialism, which enabled Westerners to see people of color as inferiors who deserve no better. Imperialism is the extension of a country's power and influence through force. Europeans created and spread the idea that people of color were less deserving of rights, respect, and power. Westerners rationalized their actions of exploiting immigrant laborers in order to feel justified and continued to frame imperialism as a way to help these races. But in reality, it was just about power and control. So even though Portugal was poor, it was still more favorable for immigrant laborers in Hawaii than Japanese and Chinese. Europeans continued to want to imperialize Hawaii even though they were a minority. Bonnichie continues to explain that immigrant labor was far more controllable than native labor. The difference made Asian labor more attractive, especially to the highly competitive monopolies of the Western United States, which suffered the additional disability of distant markets, stated by Bonnichie on page 162. It is important to understand the concept of racialization of the Portuguese and the ideology of imperialism because it goes to show how in Hawaii, even though Europeans were a minority, they still had full control over the sugar plantation. They continued to use immigrants who had a higher population in Hawaii as cheap labor simply because of their race. Yet you would assume because the Europeans were a minority, they would be used as cheap labor. But yet they were still viewed higher in the hierarchy. Imperialism was the main goal of Europeans in California and Hawaii and used immigrants such as Portuguese to obtain it. In week 9, Lisa Cacho explains a legal concept referred to as de facto status crimes. This refers to a perception that a person of a specific status, such as race, is certain to commit a future crime and might as well already committed that crime unwitnessed. It is not focused on those who did the crime, but rather those who are perceived to be criminals. A de facto status crime is when someone is criminalized and penalized for being legally vulnerable due to their racial identity. In the chapter White Entitlement and Other People's Crimes by Lisa Cacho, she explains how undocumented Mexican immigrants were an example of a de facto status crime. They were not just vulnerable to violence, but also seen as criminals and replaceable. Mexican immigrants were called illegal aliens, which is a prime example of de facto status crime. They did not need to do anything to commit a crime, but because they had a specific race, it was the crime. Not only did the de facto status crime have to work with race, but it also referred to any identity such as gender, class, or sexuality. In our week 9 lecture, Professor Gauden shows a data table referring to the racial and ethnic disparities in correctional facilities, such as prisons and jails. It showed that specifically in the US, white people are underrepresented in these prisons, while Black, American Indians, and Alaskan Natives are overrepresented. 58% of the US population is of the white community, yet only 36% of them make up correctional facilities. As for Black people, only 14% are within the US population and 42 in correctional facilities. What I found to be the most shocking is American Indians, who only make up 1% of the US population, yet still make up 3% of the correctional facilities. The same lecture showed how most confined youth are held for non-person offenses, and some are held for an act that is not a crime at all. Specifically, in 3,500 youths are locked up for offenses that aren't even crimes. Many of these people who are in jails have a less annual income than those who were never incarcerated. Through these tables, you are able to make a correlation to that relates to the de facto status crime. Not all, but many of those who were incarcerated are minority groups who have been criminalized for an act that might as well have not been seen as illegal. It's important to recognize the de facto status crime because it allowed for specific activities to be seen as criminal only because they were attached to the statuses such as race and ethnicity. Gang members, illegal aliens, and suspected terrorists remain targets and are seen as criminals despite anything else than their status. As Cacho states, when simply being is criminalized, there is little to no room for discussion of a person's reasons, motivation, or premeditated intent. All these details are assumed always already known, universal, and unchanging. Therefore, Cacho is explaining there is no room for those attached to these statuses to prove themselves innocent. In week 9, we talked about indigenous and settler colonial land, in which the example of the Yupik viewing human and non-human members as a part of society impacted my way of thinking and how I want to view life. I do not believe that animals control our destiny, but I do believe that all beings have awareness and go through the same cycle of birth and death, so we should all have the same respect for them as we do for humans. I want to apply this to my knowledge of life, as we need to have the same relationships with all beings in this world, because we all form our world and therefore should no longer have distinct lines between things such as human, non-human, race, and gender. Thank you.